Did he come back?
I'm here. Hello.
There you are. Ladies and
I'm kinda
gentlemen,
dark.
this is Dr. Kevin Korus. He's coming to us from Michigan. From Florida to Michigan. He
Uh-huh.
has no idea what it's like in Michigan at this time of year. But I can tell him we have much better stories about the weather than you get. So we're just working on new material in the last 2 days for our future stories. Kevin comes to us to discuss a look at the truths and fiction behind several of the most common agricultural myths. He has quite a bit of education behind him, a bachelor's in horticultural science, a master's in plant pathology, and a doctorate in plant health. Since 2016, he has been a member of the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Science, where he is involved in educational programming and research. So I'm sure we're all going to come away with, oh no, I thought I could do it that way. So Kevin, we're looking forward to any information you can share with us. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I am coming to you from the sunny state of Florida, and it is beautiful today. It was like 86 yesterday, but I can relate to what you guys are going through. I was born and raised in Nebraska, so right now I think they're covered in snow and they've got nasty wind blowing too, and so I'm definitely used to the woes that come along with a long winter. And by February, March, we're getting pretty sick of the winter. So I understand, and I appreciate y'all joining in, and despite maybe not having power and being run on generators. So thank you. Yeah, so my name is Kevin Korus, and let me get my slide set up here going. And then just let me know if it's in that wrong presenter mode again, so I can switch it over. So I think I might need to switch it over. If you're seeing the present, could someone let me know if they're seeing the presentation mode or my screen?
Yeah, you do need to switch over.
Okay, thank you. There we go. That should work now. Okay. So yeah, so today's topic, I was asked to just kind of talk about some of the maybe some of the most common myths or even misconceptions that are you hear about maybe in the news or talking points on social media about farming and agriculture, and you know, some of the things that come along with the production and our challenges to feed all the over 7 billion people that we have here on the planet. So we're just going to explore some of that. And as an agent of UF-IFAS Extension, I try to present mostly only the facts based on non-biased data that's gathered. So, you know, I don't try, you know, I try very hard not to speak with opinions. I'm not here to give my opinion on any of this. I'm simply here to just explore some of the science maybe that is behind some of the claims and whether those claims are really true or not. So I will give some data that's maybe anecdotal, simply because I've been in agriculture for a while now, and I've as an extension agent, I've been on many farms, both in Nebraska and here in Florida. And so I've just witnessed how farming actually plays out in the real world. So it's not necessarily science-based, but it's based on observation across many years and many different farms, producing many different kinds of commodities. So as mentioned, my name is Kevin Korus. I'm a doctor of plant health, and I think you guys are able to see my mouse possibly. So this is me over here holding the corn leaf. This is my colleague Tatiana. We have very similar degrees. She actually got her degree from here at the University of Florida. It's called the Doctor of Plant Medicine. But at the University of Nebraska, where I graduated from, it's called the Doctor of Plant Health. But it's just kind of this all-encompassing view of plant systems biology. So we learn about diseases and insects and the soil and water and plants and horticulture and weeds and everything that's involved with the science of growing plants. So currently her and I take care of Alachua County, Florida, which is where the University of Florida is. And we consult with growers, helping them to install best management practices or to implement best management practices on their farm. And best management practices are basically meant to optimize their yield, decrease and minimize and eliminate any issues with our environmental concerns, right? So to reduce environmental impact while still trying to maintain healthy yields. So that's kind of what I currently do in my position. So again, yeah, today, when I talk about agriculture and agricultural practices, I'm referring to present day, and I'm referring to those practices that occur in the U.S. Because if we're going to tackle some of these myths, every myth is based on some kind of truth. And, back in the day, farming, was a different practice than it is today. And in other countries, unfortunately, it is a different practice than it is today in the United States. So some of the things that I say won't necessarily apply to those situations in the past and in different countries. And we'll kind of talk about that too. So and then I'm going to go through some kind of myths that I hear. At the end of this, I would like an opportunity for you guys to say, oh, I've always heard this about it. And, what's the truth behind that? Or can we explore this or that? So without further ado, we can get into it. The first thing I kind of want to talk about is marketing and labeling. So when we go to the store and we look at all these agricultural products, we see all these different kinds of labels that are trying to attract us to that product. And sometimes, even though the labels themselves might be true and accurate, they're, if nothing else, misleading. So we see things like all natural and organic and antibiotic free and gluten free, hormone free, non-GMO, pesticide free, and things like that. And those will give consumers preferences over those products that are labeled as such. And again, so not to say that some of these things are untruthful. There has to be truth in advertising, but they're misleading. So for example, the kind of a big popular one nowadays is gluten. People who have celiac disease need to stay away from gluten. But gluten is only produced in wheat, barley, rye, and triticale. And triticale is just a cross between wheat and rye. And those are really the only agricultural products that are going to contain gluten. Yet you will see the gluten-free label on products that aren't made of wheat, barley, rye, and triticale. So, fruit snacks or sweet potato chips. Well, sweet potato chips are made of sweet potatoes. The kind of the picture that's zoomed in on the right hand side there, that's hummus, which is made from garbanzo beans. It's not wheat, barley, rye, or triticale. So technically they're all gluten-free, but the consumer might start to think that there's gluten in chickpeas or garbanzo beans, and that they're picking the gluten-free chickpea option. And that's not really the case. The fact is that there's just no gluten in those products. And then, the picture on the very far right, the gluten-free diet water, I think that's probably a joke and that's facetious. Although my colleague did say that she saw recently a bottle of water that said it was gluten-free and non-GMO. It's like, it's water. But so, is this a myth? I don't know, but I think it's a misconception about what is contained in an agricultural product. So moving on and we'll kind of get into this a little bit further, but there's a lot of these kinds of examples I could provide about advertising and how it's a little bit misleading. But what I basically did to prepare for this presentation was just look at some of these common myths and then just put it out there and then explore the science behind it. So the next kind of myth or misconception, because this isn't necessarily a myth, there's some good science behind here, but I would say the misconception about this is probably the word major, right? Agricultural production is a major source of greenhouse gases, and what the science says actually is that the production of agriculture itself, if we look at just the production, it only accounts for 11% of greenhouse gas emissions. So now whether we can debate whether or not 11 is a significant number or not, but that is the number. And what I think people do oftentimes is they combine the effects of agricultural production with the effects of the transportation of said goods. And really, you can't combine those. Those are two different categories. Transportation is a category in itself. Agricultural production is a separate one. So when we actually look at, and when we look at that 11% for agricultural production, it's mostly via livestock production. Agricultural soils will release carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere just naturally through microbial activity. So little microbes in the soil releasing both of those gases. And then we don't have a lot of it in the States, but rice production itself, because it's an anaerobic environment because of the water flooding, it does create some methane that can escape from rice paddies, but it's not a huge issue here in the United States. Plus, on the opposite side of this is plants actually facilitate carbon sequestration. And now that sounds like a very fancy word, right? Carbon sequestration. But carbon is one of the elements that is present in most of our greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide. The backbone of both of those structures is carbon. So when we have a lot of that in the atmosphere retains heat a lot more. So it can, again, lead to global warming if we have a lot of carbon molecules like carbon dioxide and methane freely floating in the atmosphere. So one thing that agriculture does do, plants do, are pull that carbon back out of the atmosphere and put it back into the soil. So it's carbon sequestration. It's the opposite of releasing these carbon-based elements into the atmosphere. So this is kind of a figure on how that happens. It's just really basic, but plants in general will uptake carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. They'll turn it into sugars and other complex compounds like lignin and cellulose and all these other things. And that'll eventually end up in the plant material, which ends up in the soil. So it basically pulls that out of the soil, and then of course it's re-released through the decomposition of those plant materials back up into the atmosphere. And again, that's done mostly through microbes. So just some data on that in 2018, and this is through EPA.gov. Actually, that particular quote from the carbon sequestration, 16.6 million metric tons during 2018. That figure is from Farm Bureau. I did not put that at the bottom of the slide. I apologize for that, but that figure is from the American Farm Bureau. So our practices are releasing carbon into the atmosphere, certainly, but the plants that we're putting into the ground are also taking some of it back out. So there is some flux that happens there. And then, so I mentioned transportation, right? So if we look at transportation separately, and that's both recreational people driving around and shipping costs, airplanes, trains, semi-trucks, that represents 27% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's actually quite a bit larger than when we just look at agricultural production alone. So so when I'm in presentation mode, I can't see the chat. It looks like and now I can. Okay, it looks like it's clean for now. All right, okay. So we can move on. So my biggest thing, if I am gonna, preach or educate in one manner, it would be to say, to help with this whole problem with the release of greenhouse gases, is simply to buy local if you can, if those commodities are available. It doesn't take that much, or we don't release that much greenhouse gas emissions producing these commodities. So if we can only have to move it 5, 10, 20, 100 miles versus thousands of miles, that's a better situation, because we can reduce that transportation emission of 27%. So when it's possible, I'm a big proponent of buy local. So that's mostly carbon dioxide where we're looking at. So when we do look specifically at methane, this is a figure from the EPA, and this is, so out of all the total methane emissions, this is where it's coming from. And so natural gas and petroleum systems are the largest. And then the second largest, again, you may have heard in the news recently about cow farts, right? So that's basically what enteric fermentation is. That's a very scientific word for cow farts. It's not just cows, it's ruminant animals in general. So it could be horses, sheep, goats, things of that nature. It's methane that's produced in their stomach through digestion, and then released. So it's actually, it's relatively large percent. Methane is the second largest greenhouse gas below carbon dioxide. So we're looking at 27% from that, and then 9% you'll see, well, 17% from landfills, which is shouldn't be overlooked, and then 9% from manure management. So that means, you know, we're past the gas stage, and now the animal has defecated, and then as that's sitting there or being managed, put out to fields for fertilizer, or even trying, you know, to compost, that will release methane through the degradation of that particular material. So again, it's not to say that this is a myth, but there's maybe some misconceptions out there about exactly the quantity or the responsibility that ag has for releasing some of these emissions of greenhouse gases. Another one that we're hearing a lot now too is I want something that's antibiotic free and hormone free. So with hormones, they're not allowed in poultry in the US. It's not used. So hormone free chicken. Yeah, because they're not being put into the chicken. And so when you look at the title of this slide, animal projects, and I'm stating the myths or the misconceptions up there. So those aren't facts. The titles of my slides aren't facts. They're the misconception, right? So animal products contain exogenous antibiotics and hormones. That's the myth or the misconception. So when I say exogenous, again, that's a fancy word for hormones and antibiotics that aren't produced naturally within the animal. They're given as supplements or a shot or something like that. So they're exogenous. They are made outside the animal and introduced into the animal. So not used in chickens. It is used in beef and in dairy. So we look at that second bullet below that, or the first bullet below that. And so the FDA establishes the acceptable safe limits for hormones in meat, right? So if these hormones are given to the animals, they can't end up in the meat. And if they do, they're at limits that have been tested under extensive scientific study and review to be safe if ingested by people. And then there's another one. So hormones in milk. There is only one hormone that's given. It's the BST. It is a growth hormone, and it is basically, it's a naturally produced hormone in the animal. And we are giving it exogenously simply because the animal itself isn't producing enough. So then when we think about antibiotics too, I do know some misconceptions that people think that antibiotics are just given as a blanket treatment to a whole herd of cattle or a whole flock of geese or whatever it is, or turkeys, you know, whatever you're raising. That's not how it works. You know, farmers don't want to do that. We understand, and livestock producers, we understand the risks of resistance and how to effectively use resistance management. So the reason we give antibiotics is the same reason you give antibiotics to humans. It's when you're sick. And it's usually because you are infected with another organism. Fungi, bacteria. It's typically for a bacterium, sometimes viruses. So antibiotics are typically developed for the curative action against bacterial infections. These antibiotics are given only to the sick ones. They're not given out in a blanket treatment. That drives for resistance within those bacteria to that drug type. So they're not going to try to do that. Plus, there can be no residues of antibiotics. So that it's a federal law, and it is tested that none, whether it's meat, poultry, or dairy, there cannot be antibiotic residues in that meat product. So when you see antibiotic free beef, chicken, yeah, it should all be. Another misconception. So this one is one where, you know, there may be some truth based to this, and there truth based on history, right? So farming ruins the soil is the misconception. And back in the day with old practices, or even today, unfortunately, in some other countries, there are terrible agricultural practices that ruin the soil. So when we think back to the 1930s, we can remember the Dust Bowl, right? We were not properly taking care of the beautiful soil that we had in the Midwest. So historically, yes, farming has done some horrible things to our soil. However, we have come a long way since then. And when we look at modern agriculture, regenerative agricultural practices actually build healthy soils. And you say, well, Kevin, how do you measure a healthy soil? And it's there are certain parameters that are established that measure the health of soils. And it's typically a healthy soil is something that's going to it's going to be stable. It's going to be able to facilitate plant life, right? So it increases biological activity of microbes. Diverse microbial soils are in general healthier. So it increases those microbial populations, which improves nutrient cycling, which can support beneficial organisms as well. And then, when we're looking at agriculture, of course, those soils are conducive for agricultural production because they protect against pest and disease development. Why? It's more competitive. You have other organisms in there killing and outcompeting the ones that would affect the crop negatively. And then, of course, increasing carbon sequestration, which we already talked about, plants pulling that carbon back out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. So more specifically, some of the things we do, it's a big practice. I know up in the Midwest, it's actually less common here in the South, but we are seeing the adoption of what's called no-till planting or no-till practices. The reason we had the Dust Bowl is because every time we were done with a plant, we would go in there and turn that soil over. We would disc it up. And when you do that, you really hurt, degrade soil texture. And soil texture is very important for the sustaining of plants and for the minimization of erosion, right? So you break up the soil by tilling it, you make it into finer particles that are more easily moved away with water and wind. So what we have nowadays is we plant a crop, and when we're done with that crop, we harvest it, we leave that plant in the ground, root system and all. And that root system is great. It's basically, it's plant material. So it's a ton of carbon, and those roots are holding that soil together. They're creating clods of soil, which is actually good for soil health. And they're staying in the ground. And then we've got technology now that allows us to plant right over top of that. In the past, we wouldn't be able to do that. If you sowed seeds on top of all of that other plant material, they're not going to make contact with the soil. They're not going to germinate. They could germinate, but they're not going to get their roots set down in the soil like they need. So if a seed germinates on a bunch of plant debris, it's just going to die because it can't firmly take hold of good soil and root. So what we have are these no-till drills that basically have a little bit of a disc in front of the planter that opens up just a little trough, and you can set the depth of that trough in the soil and distributes the seed, and then basically folds the soil back over it. So it's sometimes hard to tell when a field has been planted with a no-till drill because it looks the same, plant debris and all. And most plants can handle that. Some plants aren't really competitive, and that's too much plant debris for them to really succeed in. But a lot of our agricultural crops are just fine. Corn, soybeans, our cool season forage grasses and legumes down here do very well with no-till. So in the past, farming ruined the soil. We'll be honest. Presently, we're doing a lot better job making our soils very healthy. So another kind of misconception, farmers drench their crops in chemicals. And then I, of course, have a picture of a crop duster putting probably some headline of fungicide out there on corn. But the important thing to notice here, I think, or recognize, the first thing is that these products and paying that guy to come out there with his airplane and put that out is not cheap, right? So pesticides and their application is extremely expensive and getting more and more expensive. So farmers don't want that to be their first option. When it costs upwards of $30 per acre to apply a fungicide, and you have 4,000 acres, that's an incredible cost. And a lot of times you can't recoup that cost just based off of your commodity price. So again, this isn't something that farmers want to do. Although these tools are very, very helpful and they are very efficacious. So farmers really only use pesticides when all the other options aren't working, right? And we'll go into this a little bit further, but let's just take corn for an example. Rather than having to apply a fungicide every year, once, maybe even twice, a farmer will choose to plant a corn variety that may not give him the yield he wants. It may be a little less in yield, but that plant variety is resistant to whatever disease he's dealing with. So it just naturally has resistance. So he won't have to go out there and spend $30 an acre applying a fungicide. He'll have that innate resistance within the plant. And so he may not get the yield he wants, but he will also have less input costs because he will not have had to go through that field with an airplane or a tall boy sprayer and spend that money in fungicide. Also, farmers are required by law to apply only an efficacious amount of the product. So what does that mean? It's just enough of the fungicide, the herbicide, the insecticide, just enough to work. And what does that mean? Does that mean just enough to kill every single insect? No, just enough to reduce the insect load to a point where it's no longer going to decrease the yield to a point that is going to hurt him economically, to a point where it's not going to be worth the application of that chemical. So it's a very specific science. We don't want to apply any less or any more than the recommended amount, because that will also drive resistance in our pest populations. So I saw a chat in the chat box too about people who it is kind of just taking a step back about tilling in the soil, but people who insist on tilling no matter what. And I will say, on a small scale, it's not a horrible thing to do, especially if you are dealing with something like we're talking about now, plant diseases. Plant diseases, fungi, bacteria, things of that nature, typically survive in plant debris. So they're inside the leaves and the stems and the roots of the plants. And that's how they'll survive, and they'll come back from those plants to reinfect the crop next year. So if you are dealing with that situation and you have a lot of disease, it's actually good to till and to reincorporate that plant material into the soil, break it apart, expose those bad fungi and bacteria to the good fungi and bacteria that are in the soil. So tillage does have its benefits in certain situations, but it's not something you want to do just for the sake of doing it, because you will lose moisture and you will decrease your soil structure. Okay, getting back to chemicals. So in addition to that, so each state's Department of Ag regulates licensing for the application of restricted use pesticides. What does that mean? So anyone that's out there applying pesticides that you can't just get off the shelf at Walmart, okay, so not including those, including, you know, some of the ones that are a bit more acutely toxic to humans, they can't apply those, they can't buy them, they can't handle them, mix them, anything without a license. And that license requires an exam that's really difficult. I personally do education, and I put on those exams here at my office in Alachua County, Florida. And it's not easy. It's a very thick book you have to study in order to test, and you have to continue to educate yourself for the 4-year period that the license is good for. So these license holders are continuing to get education on the safe and efficacious application of pesticides. So they're making sure that they're not getting exposed and other non-target organisms are not getting exposed. So minimizing the impact on things that aren't supposed to be in contact with that particular pesticide. So, you know, and so the concern too is that when I eat food, it's going to contain pesticide residues. And unfortunately, I do think that there is probably some truth to that, right? There may be some chemicals that do escape regulation, but again, federal law does regulate the amount of pesticide that is required on post-harvest products. So after you harvest, they'll test, and it has to be below a minimum threshold, and that minimum amount has been proven by rigorous scientific data to not be harmful to ingest by humans. Also, each pesticide product that you apply is going to come with a label. That label is comprised of data that was collected over probably a 10 to 20 year period. So anytime a chemical company wants to release a new product, it takes to do all of the data and due diligence necessary for the EPA to say, yes, we can use this. So in each label, it's going to give you a post-harvest interval, pre-harvest interval. And it's going to say, you cannot apply this product 15 days before harvest, 15 days or less, right? So if you're at day 16, you can apply it. If you're at day 15, you can't apply it. And that's based on scientific data that shows how long those residues last. So up front, we are minimizing the amount of pesticide residue that's supposed to be on the plant. In addition to that, we're also testing it to make sure it's not there. So again, this is when we talk about chemical control and farmers going to that option of let's apply a pesticide, again, it's not first on their list. It really isn't. When we look at integrated pest management, which is something that we teach here at the University of Florida, and when we're looking at it for something like disease or pest control, we look at this little graph, and what we want to do is start at 12 o'clock, right? So the very top, and we want to go clockwise. So the very first thing we do if we're dealing with a disease or an insect is we say, hey, is there something we can plant here? Or is there another variety of the plant we're already using that is just naturally resistant? If so, go with it. So host resistance is usually the first option. Then there's things like mechanical control. Can we go in there and remove the ones that are disease quick before it spreads? Can we put out traps to collect insects? Can we use lights to either detract or attract elsewhere insects, things of that nature? Cultural control is simple. That just means a healthy plant is healthy, even in the presence of disease. So do all the things, watering, nutrients, sunlight, that the plant needs to be healthy. Ensure that first. Then, of course, there's options like biological control. So incorporating another living organism to help with a different organism. So there's been plenty of examples of that. Down here, we have these things called mole crickets. They're burrowing in the ground and they will eat the roots of Bahia grass, which is a huge commodity down here. It's what a lot of our grass-fed cattle eat, is Bahia grass. So Bahia grass pasture owners really need a solution to control mole cricket populations. Well, unfortunately, it's no longer available today, but there was a nematode, a microscopic worm that was developed that parasitizes the mole cricket and kills it, but doesn't parasitize anything else in the environment. So it was very specific to the problem and it worked great. So biocontrol options, if available, are always explored. And then sanitation, and this is really good for pest and disease, right? So cleaning up any infected plant material is going to reduce the amount that you have the next year or the next cropping season. And then finally, after all those are exhausted, then farmers will typically try to say, okay, well, that's not working. We're in the middle of the season. It's either I spray this or I'm losing, $100,000 on this crop. So, okay. So another myth too that I kind of hear, or a misconception, is that organic agriculture doesn't use synthetic chemicals. So a lot of people will want to ingest organic produce over conventionally produced commodities because they are under the assumption that only naturally occurring products can be used in organic agricultural production. And that's not true. There's a list, and in the Code of Federal Regulations, Statute 205.601 gives a list, and I just actually want to go over there quick and take a look. So let me re-share my screen here with the right one. I think that's the right one. So I believe you all can see my screen here. So this again is the Code of Federal Regulations. And if we look at Statute 205.601, here's a list of all of the synthetic substances allowed for use in organic crop production. Are you seeing the screen?
What?
Number on it.
Yes, we are.
Green's
Okay.
good.
Okay. So you can see there's quite a bit of chemicals, synthetic chemicals that are allowed for use, including chlorine dioxide, which is chlorine gas, and I'll have a slide on its toxicity coming up. So not all of the products that are allowed in organic production are super inert, non-toxic. Some of these things are relatively toxic, acutely toxic. So meaning if we ingest them or get them on our skin, in our eyes, or inhale them, we're going to get severely sick or even die. So, you can take a look at this. This is a document that's available to the public. And it goes through and lists not only the product, but how you can use it, whether it can actually come in contact with the plants or not, or the animals. But kind of an interesting take on that. So let me go back to my presentation. I probably have to switch that around again, don't I? Okay. So we talked about chlorine dioxide or chlorine gas, and I just wanted to show you exposure to concentrations of 35 to 51 parts per million in the atmosphere. So this is a gas, are lethal in 60 to 90 minutes. If you have 1,000 parts per million, it can be lethal within just a few minutes. So pretty nasty fumigant that they are still allowed to use in organic production. There's also kind of a misconception that organic commodities are better for you. And while, it may be possible that you are reducing your ingestion of pesticides, there's really, there are again, as we mentioned, regulations already in play for conventional agriculture that limit the amount of pesticides that you could be in contact with. But the conventional pesticides that are used, yes, you will not be exposed to those. Whoops, with organic produced commodities. However, they are nutritionally about the same. And this is from a study from UC Davis. So when you compare conventionally produced fruits, vegetables to organically produced, there's very little increased nutritive value, if any, in the organic. And same way with milk. There's really, as far as they can tell, no differences nutritionally. And then, I just find it kind of ironic, if anything else, a lot of people don't want to be exposed to these pesticides because they fear things like cancer or just, the adverse effects, health effects of things, these pesticides. So it's kind of hard to read, but if you look up here, this particular cigarette brand uses organic tobacco, and it's a thing. It drives a high price. But we have plenty of data showing that tobacco does lead to things like cancer. But people still want it to be produced organically, even though in and of itself, tobacco is maybe not the best thing to consume for your health. Another big kind of controversy, if you will, that's been in the news a lot, and there have been, especially in California, cases where people have been awarded many millions of dollars, I think for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cases, as a result of exposure to glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. So what does the science say? And these court cases are being won because it's a jury of peers, not a jury of scientists. And but again, what does the science actually say about glyphosate? So we think of toxicity on two different levels. Acute toxicity, meaning if we take something, it's going to make us sick within 24 hours, right? So if something is acutely toxic, we take it, we could die immediately. Arsenic, things like that, cyanide, very acutely toxic. You don't need very, very much either. Very tiny amount can do that, right? So when we look at something like glyphosate and we look at its acute toxicity, no, it's not acutely very toxic to us, we would have to, so the LD50 means the lethal dose to kill 50% of a population. So you would have to take 5,000 milligrams per kilogram, right? Which is a relatively large amount when you look at something, versus something that could be 1 milligram per kilogram. That would be very acutely toxic. So would you get upset stomach? Would you get sick from drinking a cup of Roundup? Yeah, probably. It'd probably make you puke, and it wouldn't be great for you. But in order for it to really kill you, you'd have to drink quite a bit of it. But that's not what these cases are based off of. These cases are based off of what's called chronic toxicity. So is something chronically toxic, meaning small exposure, many years, over many years, day in and day out, will it build up to a cancerous effect? And so studies on that have shown that, and so this is the IRAC group, which is the, I can't remember the name, but it's basically the institute that's in charge of researching cancer. And cancerous or carcinogenic materials. And so they classify all these materials that could possibly be carcinogenic into different categories or groups. So glyphosate has recently been categorized as a group 2A. And this is based on limited evidence of cancer in humans from real world exposures that actually occurred and sufficient evidence of cancer in experimental animals. From studies of pure glyphosate. So probably carcinogenic to humans. So what can you find in group 2A as other chemicals or examples of things that are probably carcinogenic to humans? So other group 2A carcinogens include red meat. So the consumption of red meat, being a hairdresser, being exposed to those workplace conditions, and very hot beverages above 65 degrees Celsius. So the same amount of data was collected from those three, things that classified them in the same group 2A as glyphosate. So the risk seems small. It doesn't say it's impossible, but it's that is the evidence. So whether it does or not, it's not my opinion. I'm not here to say that again, but that's how it's been classified. And then kind of one of the last things, a couple of subjects, and I want to touch on is you hear a lot about genetically modified organisms or GMOs, right? And I think there's a lot of mislabeling that goes along with GMOs as well. So technically, the definition of a genetically modified organism is an organism that would not exist naturally through traditional breeding. So I think there are two really important words in this definition: naturally and traditional breeding. So maybe three words. Because if you think about a process of selective breeding, right? So if we take two animals that are able to breed, same species, and we cross them and we take their children and we select which ones we want out of those to breed for certain characteristics, we are selecting for genes through breeding that wouldn't occur naturally. That selection wouldn't necessarily occur by nature. We are biasing that breeding selection as humans. So I would call that not natural, nor would I call that traditional breeding. I would call that selective breeding. So based on that definition, dogs could be a GMO, purebred dogs. Because would purebred dogs have existed if humans hadn't selectively bred them for characteristics such as, long floppy ears, loose skin, smallness? So in a way, when I hear GMO, I think, well, a dog could technically be GMO. If that's too controversial, I can back off of that example and go to a plant example. Corn. Corn's ancestor is a plant called teosinte. Teosinte was a tillering plant, which means it didn't necessarily come from one stalk. It came from multiple stalks. And you can kind of see that in that figure on the right. And although it produced seed kernels, they weren't nearly as many nearly as big and nearly as full of starch and the sugars that are in there now. It was only through selectively breeding this plant after years and years and years of selecting the bigger corn, basically the one with the bigger ear, over hundreds of years, that we have the corn that we have today. So would that have occurred naturally through traditional breeding? Probably not. So corn is, in my opinion, genetically modified. What I think people really mean when they say genetically modified is a transgenic organism. So when you see a non-GMO label to a product, or when people are talking about GMOs in general, what they're actually meaning is transgenic, which means an organism, or even just a cell, whose genome, whose genome that they were born with, has been altered, or has another piece of foreign DNA introduced to it by artificial means. This can actually happen naturally. Transgenic organisms occur in nature, which is kind of crazy, because now we're back to, well, that's natural. They can occur in nature by bacteria and viruses, right? That's what a virus does, is it manipulates your DNA and gets your cells to produce a protein that the virus wants. That's how a tumor works. A bacterium is taking over your cells and getting your DNA. It's placing their DNA in yours and getting your cells to produce the proteins that it wants and create tumors. So viruses and bacteria do this naturally, but we discovered that as humans and how these particular organisms do that. And so now we are able to select for genes that exist within, say, bacteria, splice that gene out, and then put it into a plant. And that is a transgenic organism. And that is typically what people mean when they say GMO, is a transgenic plant. So that's basically what is being graphed over here, is that you are able to, we as humans are able to take DNA out of a bacterium. So for instance, BT corn, you've perhaps heard of BT corn, is a transgenic plant. A GMO, which it's a transgenic plant. It has foreign genes in it from a bacterium. And we selected a gene in there that the bacteria produces that codes for a protein that will kill butterfly and moth larvae. So Lepidopterous larvae, caterpillars. Caterpillars are a major pest of corn. So basically what we're able to do is have a corn plant now that can express a protein that it wouldn't normally express, but it's expressing it because it has a very small section of a bacterium's DNA embedded within its own. So that's an example of a very common one. So quiz time. So in the chat, if you would, feel free to give a guess as to how many plant crops do you think are available for purchase or produced in the United States that are transgenic, that have a foreign gene into their genome? How many commodity types or plant species do you think exist? I'll give you a little bit of time to answer. Where did there it is. Seeing some percentages. So 60% of the commodity types, 70%, 10%, 40. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to at least 50% of the crops. I'm going to exit out of this and I'm going to stop sharing again and go to a website. Let's see. There we go. Stop share. So the answer is, out of all of the commodities that are produced, only 11 have transgenic plants, have transgenes. Summer squash, apples, alfalfa, soybeans, pineapple, papaya, corn, cotton, potatoes, sugar beets, and canola. And there are actually 2 animals now that have transgenes: aquatic salmon and gal-safe pig. And we'll go into a little bit more about what those genes are kind of doing for those particular animals. So there's only 11 out of all the different types of commodities. So when you see a a bag of blueberries and it says non-GMO, well, there are no transgenic or GMO blueberries produced. So of course it has to be non-GMO, right? So the only way that that really makes sense is if it's a product that may contain corn or a corn product, soybeans or some kind of soy product. It would make sense for that labeling to say, hey, this is from a non-GMO source of soybeans, a non-transgenic source of soybeans. But again, you see it on strawberries. Well, no strawberries are transgenic. So again, just truth in advertising gets gets a little wonky when you know that you've got a selling point by simply saying non-GMO. All right, let's close out of that. Go back to the presentation. Okay, 45. All right, I'll kind of go quickly through this last part. Let me switch that around. So this is from the FDA. Just kind of some question and answers. So what about animals? And so when I say animals, I'm not only talking about the livestock, but I'm talking, you can all of this directly relates to humans as animals. So us, right? So what about animals that eat food that's made from GMO crops, right? So more than 95% of animals used for meat and dairy in the United States are eating GMO crops. Okay, so they're eating corn, they're eating soy. There is no difference in how the GMO versus the non-GMO. And okay, so this is from the FDA and they're still using the word GMO, which again rubs me. I wish they would say transgenic, but for the sake of just reading what they wrote, I'm going to say GMO. And when I say GMO, I mean a crop that has a foreign gene in it. So there is no difference between how GMO and non-GMO foods affect the health and safety of animals. DNA in GMO food does not transfer to the animal that it eats. I've heard that. I have a friend that believes that when you eat a transgenic crop, that trans gene is going to get embedded into your DNA. That's just not how it works. Animals that eat GMO food do not become genetically modified, right? If they did, then any animal would have the DNA of any food it ate, right? So we would, a cow would be the grass it ate, chickens would be the corn they ate, we would be the rib sandwich. It's not how that transfer works. So DNA from GMO animals does not make its way into the meat or the eggs or the products from those animals either. You're not going to find that particular transgene in there if a cow eats transgenic corn, right? It's not going to end up, that transgene from the corn will not end up in the meat or the milk of that cow. So food like eggs, dairy products, and meat that come from animals that eat GMO food are equal in nutritive value, safety, and quality than those that come from those that eat foods that come from a non-GMO source. So who makes sure that this food is safe that animals eat? Of course, it's the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. It's the primary regulatory agency. So this is specifically for animals. Well, it's for humans too, I guess. So and responsible for ensuring the safety of GMO and non-GMO foods and for animals. And again, they do similar things, of course, for human food. So we talked about GMOs in the animal food supply, and so there are two: the Aqua Advantage salmon, and it has been modified so that it can reach a growth point a little bit faster. I'm a plant person. I'm not necessarily an animal person, so I can't speak as in depth about these transgenic organisms as I can with the plants. But then there's the alpha-gal syndrome, AGS. It's some kind of allergic reaction that happens to people who ingest it, will have an allergic reaction to it. And for however the science works on this one, I'm not sure about, I'll be honest. But basically that allergen is no longer there, or it's mitigated somehow. And then of course, are GMOs used in anything besides food? And the big one is yes. The big one's cotton. It's just mostly used for textiles and clothing. But there are some other examples of crops that aren't used for food that are GMO. This is the last topic that I'll kind of touch on, and it's hard because it's very controversial, and I don't know that there is rigorous scientific data that can prove or disprove something like livestock producers engage in animal cruelty. You know, I unfortunately think that there are cases that happens. But what I can say, and again, I don't like to do this, I don't like to resort to these methods, but I can use anecdotal data. And again, I've been on hundreds of farms between Nebraska and Florida and in between. You know, I see genuine care and concern and love in the producers for their animals. They do want to provide them with sanitary and you know, cozy lifestyles. You know, there can be a debate on whether or not animal harvesting is humane or not. Not really touching on that. It's the actual livelihood of the animals on farm. Again, I feel like farmers are very good stewards of the land, the plants that they grow, the soil that they need to grow those plants, and the animals that they have to provide us with food. So I believe that is my last slide, and I did want to open it up if anyone has something that they kind of wished I had maybe talked about and hadn't, or if just something you're curious about, you can go ahead and enter it into the chat or however you feel, and I'll try to get to it. I think it looks like we have maybe 10 minutes left here, and reading a question here. Oh, so the question is about the spill that happened up in Ohio. One of my initial impressions and concerns, and the agricultural impact. I do confess ignorance on that. I don't know, and apparently they're being kind of really hush hush about it. Not a lot of people know the extent of that spill. I'm not sure what the product was. I'm not sure what the products are, if there was more than one product that spilled. And I can't remember if it was associated with a waterway. I want to say that this happened close to the waterway. I must claim ignorance on this news story. I know it's huge, but I have not paid enough specific attention to it. So it depends on what was spilled. It depends on, you know, the amount, whether it was connected to a water body and whether it's water miscible or water soluble, and just kind of the geology in the soil of where it happened is going to tell us if that chemical went through the soil and into you know, underlying water bodies. The chemical properties of whatever was spilled may keep that from happening. I just don't know enough to really give a good feel on that. So great question, but sorry, I don't have a great answer. Is there an ingredient on a label that you would recommend that we stay away from? You know, not really. So everything that is approved by the EPA as a pesticide, again, has gone through rigorous 10 to 20 years of data. So if you use it in accordance with that label and you do the things that it says, you will be safe. It will tell you which protective equipment you need, whether it's goggles, face shield, gloves, if it needs to be neoprene, if it needs to be polystyrene, boots, you know, long sleeves. It's going to tell you everything. It's going to tell you how much of that product. It's going to tell you if there's water nearby and you're not supposed to spray it, how far away it has to be. It's going to tell you to look out for bees if it's harmful. Anyway, it's going to tell you all of that information. So I would be concerned about the handling of very, very, very acutely toxic products. So products that you only need a tiny bit of exposure to be harmful. I would be aware of those, but you have to have a pesticide license to apply those. So those aren't something you can go to the store and pick up. Plus, think of bleach. Is bleach regulated? Do you have to have a license to buy bleach? No, it's under everyone's kitchen counter. And that is extremely toxic. And we just know to be very, very careful with that. So it's the same thing with pesticides. They can be used very, very safely if we just follow the label. When shopping at farmers markets, how can one inquire about the grower sellers' true agricultural practices, trust the answers, and not irritate the growers or sellers? That's a great question. You know, I mean, if they're certified organic, then they are certified. They are getting visits from the federal government. They're looking at their farm. They are having to keep intense records of everything that goes on. They have to be certified organic for like 5 years in one area before they can even start selling produce off of that. So if they have a certification, then that's great. If they simply say they're organic, they could be putting anything out there. So how do you get that trust? I tell you, that's not easy, you know, and other than just going to a U-pick operation, being able to go out and actually see someone's methods of producing. That's not as big of a thing where you guys are from. Down here, U-pick operations are huge on blueberry and strawberry and all sorts of things. So that's one way, but I mean, that's a good question and it's tricky, but make sure that, you know, if they're saying that they're organic, you know, you could, I don't think it would be too rude to ask to see their certification. Generally speaking, why do we have GMO plants? What is the advantage? Wow. So, you know, in general, there have been so many incredible things that have happened because of transgenic plants. Basically, the corn industry was at risk before BT. We wouldn't be the agricultural powerhouse we are today with that. But in more severe cases, rice in the Philippines was at risk. They basically were going to get to a point where they wouldn't be able to produce it anymore because of an insect pest. And until and this was livelihoods. This is people living and dying off of rice. And after the introduction of a transgenic rice plant that was resistant to this pest, they could grow their commodities again without concern. They didn't have to apply pesticides. That's another thing too. So transgenic plants allow us to actually drastically reduce the amount of pesticides that we have to put out, because we're putting into plants a defense mechanism against pests and diseases. So instead of using chemicals to do that, the plant itself is doing it. So generally speaking, that's a huge advantage, is the reduction in pesticides that do have to actually go out. I have a question about PFAs. I'm gonna plead ignorance on that one. I'm not sure what a PFA is. Is that a volatile chemical? Let me just exit out of my presentation real quick.
I think they're talking about the types of chemicals that are resistant, never die. They're in the soil forever.
Yeah. Yeah, and things like that are harmful, but a lot of those particular chemicals aren't going to be taken up by the plant, which is good. Some of them will, unfortunately, and if that's the case, if it is a compound that is, you know, tricking plants into taking it up and then we're consuming it, that's definitely an issue. But a lot of those will actually stay put in the soil. So a lot of those aren't necessarily a concern unless, again, they're being extracted and then we're being exposed to them. What are the FDA requirements for produce coming from other countries, especially South America and Asia? They have to meet the same rigorous standards in terms of all of the things that it's the same. Well, we can't enforce our production regulations on them, so we can't really force them to produce it the way we want them to, but the end product has to meet our standards in terms of whether or not there are pesticide residues or any other kinds of residues and things like that. So they're definitely regulating the end product. I don't know how much push we have or leverage to actually regulate the production of it. And we see this a lot, unfortunately, with E. coli breakouts in lettuce, where we're getting lettuce or other greens from countries that use, they have a fancy name for it now, but it's basically human effluent as a nitrogen source. They're using it as fertilizer and they're applying it post emergence. So the lettuces they're growing and they're putting human effluent on it. And I won't name countries, but it's happened before and we're getting E. coli breakouts. So we can't get them to stop doing that. We can just only say, we're not going to buy your product anymore if that's how you do it, type of a thing. So we can be selective on where we get our commodities from, and we can be selective on kind of the residues and things that are on them once they get to our shores. What do you recommend for killing weeds besides polling? You know, it depends on the weed. I hate to say it depends because that's kind of a cheap answer, but if you can prevent that weed from producing seeds, if that's how it reproduces, is via seeds. So if you can get out there and mow it or something before it's able to produce that seed set that can help reduce those populations. It depends on where your weeds are. If your weeds are encroaching into your lawn or something like that, whatever the desirable plant is in that environment, do whatever you can to make sure that it is fully healthy and growing, right? Cultural practices, and that can help, basically strengthen that environment against the encroachment of weeds. So prevention, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say. And if some of those more traditional methods don't work, again, there are selective herbicides that work very, very well, depending on what weed you're dealing with, if you want to apply them. If you don't, that's fine, but there are very efficacious herbicides that are out there that don't remain in the environment very long if you use the specific amount that is stated on the label. And then, is European agriculture as up to date as us? That's kind of a tough question. I think I would say, we're neck and neck. They have different regulations. They have different stringencies on things, allowabilities on things. I probably am not as up to date in foreign policy as I should be, but in terms of, if you're talking about technology, we're neck and neck. And I don't know enough about their allowances. I don't think they're allowed to even sell transgenic plants in Europe, but I could be wrong on that. So I unfortunately don't have the expertise to give that a good enough answer. But yeah, we are, looks like right at 11 o'clock. So I hope that was enjoyable, and I hope y'all learned something, and I hope y'all get your power back as soon as possible, and spring rears its head as soon as possible as well. So thank you for your time and attention, and it was a pleasure for me.
Kevin, thank you. Here's my first reaction.
Mhm.
Do you teach online courses that we can all just sign up for courses? There was so much information, and just the number of questions that you're receiving is a good indication that you've got everybody thinking. So we really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm making a push to produce more online material. I'm behind my colleagues, to be honest. Some of them, I'm a millennial, but I am bad with technology, very bad. So I'm learning, and a lot of the things we do offer are hybrid. Alachua County Extension, you can, if you just Google that, Alachua County, Florida Extension, you'll get our office with all of our information that's posted up there. But a lot of the work I do is intimate one-on-one teaching with my growers. I go out to their field. I'm out there driving in the pickup truck with them, looking at their whatever it is, peanuts down here a lot of times. And we're doing education that way. But I do teach classes mostly in person, but you never know. Coming up here, I might offer more online. So.
Thank you. And if you notice the chats, you're getting lots of thank yous from everyone else.
Great,
we really
great.
Appreciate it.
Great. And, if you don't know about extension is the nation's best kept secret, even though we're not trying to keep it a secret. And there's extension in every single state and every single county of the US. So if you have, questions too about agriculture and just plant production, animal production in general, reach out to your local extension agents. And if they don't know, they can connect you with someone locally that does. So.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
You have a great day.
Okay. You as well. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who came. I think we ended up with 49 plus Kevin. A wonderful turnout considering all of our challenges today. So you all have a good weekend, and don't forget to read the newsletter next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.